Hi, this is Charlie Willson. Welcome to ThinkTech Hawaii. Today we're talking about creating a sustainable Hawaii. How do we do this, and what's the term really mean? We have a lot of people who toss around the whole notion of sustainability. Sometimes it's a loose word. So we're going to talk a little bit about the characteristics of a sustainable future. Hopefully something about the sustainability criteria by which we could evaluate proposed projects and policies. There's some things that are difficult to talk about because we don't always have a language to discuss them. But we're moving in the right direction. So we're going to try to set up a framework to organize some of these concepts for future shows. Today I brought in two people as guests who've spent a long time thinking about and promoting sustainability issues. My guests today are Sweeny and Aubrey Yee. Both are graduate students at the University of Hawaii in the Future Studies program. Both are teaching political science courses while they finish up their PhDs. They're both graduate researchers for the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies. I'm going to hand it over to them and let them do a really brief intro of how they got there, how they got here, what's your trajectory. You want to start, John?
Yeah, sure. So I moved here 8 years ago, feels like a long time, to get my master's degree, which is actually in religion. And then I sort of found my way, as many people have, into future studies. And I don't think there's a better outlet, at least at the university, for asking big questions, taking multidisciplinary approaches. And so for me, the whole context of sustainability, like you've already mentioned, is dealing with this question of the future, and the future is a question mark. And so what I'm really drawn to, and futures in my work specifically, looks at what are the implications of climate change, how do we navigate these immense challenges that humans haven't seen in millennia, right? How do we deal with this? So for me, it's about asking big questions, and then asking, I think, even more difficult, challenging questions, and maybe not coming up with the best answers, but having a commitment to ask the hard questions and then to see where that takes you.
And a little bit of look at the deep future side of it too.
Right.
Excellent.
Yeah, definitely. I'm born and raised here in Hawaii, so I left for a time and actually came back to Hawaii and started a business, and so I kind of aspects of economics and the way Hawaii's been going, and I wanted to go back to school and find a way to make a difference. And I found the Future Studies program, and I just really like the broad term thinking, the way that we look at issues and try to look deeply into what the implications are down the line. And I feel like the state of Hawaii hasn't done enough of that, so we're here to hopefully bring that back around.
The state is more inclined to do studies than it is to implement actions here, and a lot of times we've got some really good ideas, and the state will set a goal such as energy self-sufficiency was set as a goal back three years ago, something like that. And the goal was, what, 2 years ago, 3 years ago? Didn't come close. In talking about sustainability, this can be applied to all kinds of things. We can be looking at housing, we can be looking at transportation systems. We could be looking at how we design future development, and we can talk about ag policy also. One of the things that's always kind of concerned me is food security. I hear, well, the figures are that we have about 6 days worth of food on shelves in supermarkets here, and there's no way without fossil fuels to transport stuff in that we would be able to feed ourselves. I know you've done a lot of work on that.
Yeah.
Want to bring us up to date a little bit on some of that?
Well, it's definitely a big issue, and I think a lot of people are becoming more aware of our fragility in terms of food security. And there's a lot of movement happening at the community level, in grassroots. I'm involved with Kanu Hawaii, and we do a lot of work on food security and those sorts of issues. And I just recently attended the North Shore Community Land Trust food conference that they had on the North Shore, and there's a lot of work being done by people in the community trying to increase the local availability of food, but we have a long way to go. I think they're saying the figures currently are about 8% of our food is being grown locally, which is up from what it was, but obviously a long way to go.
So we're making slight progress.
We're making progress. The big thing is, we don't have any animal husbandry happening. So there's a lot of movement, say, in growing vegetables and different kinds of crops. Like we still don't have a slaughterhouse or a way to do any sort of animal husbandry on any sort of large level. So there's a lot of areas that could be expanded upon. So
how about the impact of projects? I mean, we have projects like Koa Ridge going in.
That's another big thing is, urban land, agricultural lands being converted to urban development. So whether or not we focus on developing the urban core and trying to save some of our agricultural lands, you know, we've had the important agricultural lands distinction, but it hasn't really been used. So how do we start to refocus our priorities in saving some of that open space, especially the currently productive open space?
And it seems like there has been a renaissance with
Yeah.
people's attentiveness to food and thinking about a local food culture. And I think with restaurants like Town, and we
Definitely.
did a consultation with the Hawaii Food Policy Council at the last Ag Conference, at least since the time that I've been here. And actually in between my master's and my PhD, I worked for Styrophobia, which sells biocompostables. And so I really got to know that community. Actually, I got to meet Aubrey well before
Yeah.
we started the same PhD program. But thinking about what would it take to create a sustainable food system? I mean, oftentimes to look into the future, you should look into the past, right? Native Hawaiians had 1 million people here. They sustained them. They had a rich, diverse diet. And it took essentially massive efforts, right? It took irrigation, fish ponds, cultivating things in the right appropriate places. For a while there, the former mayor had this 21st century ahupua'a sort of ethic. But I think we start to see these things sort of taking root. And I think for all of us, it never seems like it's fast enough, right?
Yeah.
So the rate of change, I think, is the elephant in the room. The key question is, you know, relative to the challenges of global warming and climate change, how much time do we have, and are we really doing enough, and how do we really move that forward?
The old Hawaiian perspective, I think, is valuable because it shows you that we can support numbers of people, at least on the neighbor islands, that are equivalent to the populations there today,
Yeah.
and we can do that without fossil fuels.
Yeah,
I
we
mean,
have really unique resources here with our Native Hawaiian history and ancestry. So I think utilizing that as much as possible is really important.
Right, and I think there's a couple schools of thought, at least as I see within sustainability, of thinking that sustainability wouldn't entail sacrifice, that we're moving through new technologies, a means of sort of sustaining a certain kind of lifestyle. And then I think perspective that says, well, wait a second, maybe it's the sort of broader implications of that lifestyle that we need to think about. Is that what we want to sustain for future generations, right? And so I think what comes with sustainability for me is that sense of legacy, right? Like how do we leave this place, and what are we leaving to future generations, and how do we engage thinking about them, but also then taking advantage of what we can for today. And that's, I mean, that was the classic definition of the Brundtland notion of sustainability that came out of Our Common Future in 1987, right? Meeting the needs of the present without forsaking the needs of future generations. And that really is, I think, driven the conversation on sustainable development, but I think it's starting to mutate sort of beyond that and think about other, you know, broader horizons.
Yeah, because in so many ways, sustainability doesn't have to mean sacrifice, where I think in certain ways it's been conflated with that, and it doesn't have to be. So how do we reimagine what success is? How do we reimagine what
Right.
the good life is? Reconnecting with community, finding joy in those sorts of things that don't require a lot of material goods per se.
Right, yeah, so far, I mean, a lot of our research looks at how notions of sustainability have been wedded to growth. And so that big sort of, you know, like paradigm shift, is it in fact, you know, sustainable to have a growth-based economy? In Hawaii, we live and die with tourism and the military, right? So when tourism dips, right, if the military contract or, you know, these cuts come in, all of a sudden, you know, it's a different place to live, right? And it affects education and everything else. So, you know, how do we build and really like cultivate a sense, I think, of resiliency? And that, I think, is what is really driving a lot of the conversation today about sustainability, even though in many ways the projects are slow to catch up to that, right? But I think there's a palpable sense that people have that that's what we need to move towards, right?
Yeah.
Really be a place of resiliency and be able to, as our advisor says, surf the tsunamis. And obviously in the last couple of years, that's come to mean something very, very different, right?
Yeah.
Visceral you know, analogy. But I think that ultimately that's what we want. We want to be able to navigate change and hopefully end up with a better place, at least than how we found it.
You probably should clarify what you mean by surf the tsunamis. Just
Yes.
because to futures people, it means something very different.
Yeah,
Right.
Tsunamis of change.
Right, tsunamis of change, yeah, not the actual tsunami. Although, you know, with that said, I think that you're starting to see communities in the wake of the tragedy, obviously, of Fukushima and the ongoing concerns about radiation, rethink big picture sorts of perspectives, right? About energy and about the placement of energy facilities, and like, do we really want to have this integrated grid? Like, how do we find a way to, you know, localize that? And I think rethink. And fortunately, I think it's always at the precipice of crises that we end up doing that. But I think
Yes.
people are seeing that and foreseeing it, hopefully, you know, through some anticipatory methods to work towards sustainable change.
Well, we tend, as who was it? Kaufman in At Home in the Universe explains that living type systems evolve to exploit maximum efficiency out of their environment. And what happens is that pushes you closer and closer to the critical edge. And as as you try to live at the edge of criticality, you're much closer to collapse. Some little unexpected event, some disturbance here pushes you over, and then you get massive problems. And we see that already in various places. We see that after Katrina, we see that after major storms, and the likelihood is that we will be having more major storms in the future because climate change is pushing that direction. We can talk about that a little bit further as we go along. Now, you brought up the notion of resilience. I like that a lot, mostly because I tend to think of things in terms of resilient systems versus brittle systems. A brittle system being one where you're far closer to the edge, where something goes wrong, all of a sudden something snaps and the system goes down. And this was introduced, well, it kind of came into the popular vocabulary. Around 1972, there was a book written called Limits to Growth, and I don't know if we can get this on here, but 1972, Limits to Growth was a study which took all the different factors, plugged them into a computer model, and said, here are the things that push us toward collapse. And that kind of introduced a lot of this. So what do you think of the whole limits to growth notion? Do you see hard limits here?
Well, I mean, I think that's hard to define. You know, that's part of the debate, and you get into that whole debate of where are the limits, where it's, to me, more productive to start to look at the question of what sort of lifestyle are we trying to create. You know, so yes, there are limits, we know that, but where they are could be contested. So then you start to look at, well, what sort of vision of a successful life and a happy life and a meaningful life are we trying to work towards? And it could be a much more positive conversation. But I do think that book had a really important place in terms of waking people up to what was happening. But I feel like the conversation now is shifting towards more productive sort of measures towards creating resiliency. And back to your point of resiliency versus sustainability, I feel like sustainability just as a word in itself is talking about sustaining something that already exists, whereas resiliency brings in the idea that things will change, and so we don't know exactly what it's going to be like in the future, but if we have a resilient system, we're more adaptable and able to shift with the times and remain resilient throughout time. So.
Right, yeah, and I think that exact dynamic is what we've seen play out with a lot of the international cores, specifically for carbon emissions, right? You have developing countries come back and say, well, wait a second, like for us to limit our growth, right? For us to, you know, it's not sustainable for us. Like we realize that you've done X, Y, and Z, and you've had your period of massive growth, and now you're cutting, right? And the U.S. recently dropped to 1990s levels. China has now taken over as the world's largest polluter, and so that whole dynamic of thinking about sustainability and growth, and like Aubrey's saying, like trying to divorce that and rethink precisely what do we mean by growth, right? People are about green growth, or how do we have a resilient economy that again extends beyond present generations and hopefully moves us into a better future. I think is starting to turn, right? But again, I think thinking about policy and projects, we hopefully can sort of move in a better direction. I mean, one of the interesting things about the limits to growth at the time that it came out was at a time in the early 70s when lots of places were thinking about the future. So Hawaii, for example, did the Hawaii 2000 project, thinking about how would you build a sustainable future. Unfortunately, we're living in that worst case scenario. We are completely dependent on tourism, on military, over, sort of like, over development, right? We have different area. And so I think that ultimately, it's not that we did a bad job, but it's that I think we didn't pay enough attention to some of those warning signs that were raised here and elsewhere for thinking about sustainability divorced from growth, right? How do we think about not just sustainable development, but rethink then and integrate resiliency into those models?
Or how we grow. And I mean, the trade-off is, are you going to grow or are you going to die? Systems stop growing,
Sure.
They're dying, But we can grow in a direction that is considerably more resilient.
Yeah.
And
not as consumptive, perhaps.
Right. And avoids the brittle parts which are easily broken here. And that's probably a good, if we're going to establish a sustainability criteria, that's probably one of the elements we need to look at. How resilient is this system to change, and how brittle is this in the face of wild card events,
Sure.
tsunamis, hurricane, major storm surges, climate change, you name it.
Yeah.
Unforeseen events,
Yeah.
disruptions in energy supply, because energy will be a big one. This is the only state in the union that is run predominantly on oil, and I think that's about I'm not sure what the current figure is. I think it was 86 to 88% oil. That's not a good situation to be in. Right. Okay. Regarding the difference, when we talk about growth, when you look at a natural system, you see something that's very different than you see in artificial systems. Take a feedlot for growing cattle,
industrial
chickens,
agriculture versus
right, industrial ag versus. Well, there's an example. There's a place called Polyface Farms. If people are interested at home, you can Google Polyface Farms, and I believe they're in Virginia. They work on a deep sustainable model. The difference is that nowadays industrial agriculture pushes food crops into a monocrop situation where you tend to get some sort of a virus that takes over, a bug that eats that particular crop. All of a sudden you have a major crop failure. Similarly, when you take cattle and put them in a feedlot, you take something which nature would use as a resource and it turns it into a pollutant, whereas you put a cow in the field, it has various different plants that it likes to eat depending on how it's feeling that day, a smorgasbord of food, and it deposits fertilizer out the other end. Very nice little controlled systems. You put a feedlot up, all of a sudden the cow is standing in filth. It needs all kinds of antibiotics to keep it healthy, and the waste product goes into a river or a stream and pollutes downstream. Let me turn that back to you. How do you see that changing in Hawaii? Do you see that there's a possibility for improvements in agriculture and improvements that will help keep a sustainable system going?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see the movement in agriculture in Hawaii, well, in terms of the local food movement, is towards more diverse, less monocrop, more kind of resilient agriculture in general, and that seems to be the trend sort of nationwide. I was just talking to a guy the other day that started a group called Farm Hack, and they're trying to do open source innovation for farming. So they're creating a platform for people to build software, everything from monitoring systems where you get a text on your smartphone that tells you if your greenhouse is overheating, or people that are building physical tools, but sharing all that information. So trying to boost the speed of innovation by detangling it from any sort of economic motive.
That was called Farm Hack?
It's called Farm Hack, yeah. So actually if you Google Farm Hack, they're part of the National Young Farmers Association, I believe it is.
Let's come back to that in just a second. I've got to take a break here. For people who want to look that up, Farm Hack.
Farm Hack.
Okay, great. We'll be right back.
We want to thank our underwriters. Hawaiian Electric Company and its affiliates Maui Electric on Maui and Hawaii Electric Light Company on Hawaii Island are deeply committed to the communities they serve. Galen Ho is a senior executive of BAE Systems, a global defense, security, and aerospace company. The High-Tech Development Corporation, the state's leading technology agency, attached to the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism. Castle in Kokowai, with a time-honored legacy that spans more than 160 years and revolves around its mission of investing in Hawaii, creating communities, and providing for the needs of our state. Hawaii Gas, formerly the Gas Company, a proponent of the Liquefied Natural Gas Initiative, helping Hawaii achieve its transition to clean energy and a better energy future. Collateral Analytics, a Hawaii-based tech company empowering the real estate industry with greater and faster access to the tools and data they need to make better informed property investment decisions. I'm Nicole Horry. Thanks so much for joining us on ThinkTech. I'm Maria Kashen. See you next time.
Hi, we're back again. We were talking about sustainability with Aubrey Yee and John Sweeny. And when we broke, we were on Farm Hack.
Yes, so I was speaking to the current acting chair of Farm Hack, and basically he was talking about working with all these young farmers and how he's seeing this trend, and I think we're all seeing it, of moving towards more diverse, less monocrop type of agriculture, and that really is the wave of the future. And people talk about that as being like small farms, but some of these farms are actually pretty sizable. So I think we're seeing a move away from that sort of trend, and even on the bigger industrial agricultural end, people are doing big long-term experiments that show that multi-cropping is much more productive than monocropping. So
yes,
I I think that's the way of the future for sure.
And more resilient.
Right,
Definitely.
right. And I just did a bunch of research on this. The really shift in what is seeming to be the fifth wave of environmentalism, at least in the U.S., is that agrarian sort of land ethic and a return to cultivating native species, looking at like how precisely do you keep these systems resilient, right? Like how do you build that resiliency into it? And I think it really requires an attentiveness to the complexity of these open systems, right? And it's really forcing people to rethink what does it even mean to say that something's native, right, within a certain context,
Sure.
and how do we identify that, and then how do we find things that help to support total life systems instead of just how do we feed people? And I think that really has started to come along and to really, I think, open up sustainability to some really interesting questions.
When you get into the deep future, they also talk about developing perennials so that you're not planting an annual crop. If you look at a lot of wild grains throughout the Midwest, you see a perennial crop that doesn't require external watering systems, doesn't require fertilizer, doesn't require pesticides, and it still grows and comes back every year.
Yeah.
In the deep future, we're probably looking at a return to that, you know. However, the movement right now on the side of corporate agriculture is monocrop, tailoring your fertilizer to your specific seed, tailoring your pesticides, and going with a GMO seed, which we'll probably have as a topic for another show.
Right.
It's a big one.
GMOs is a big one. Okay. We see a couple of other things happening that work against sustainability. One is pollution of the oceans. One is depletion of fresh water supplies. Pollution in the ocean right now, we see a very negative trend. Either one of you want to speak to that? Or
Yeah, I know one of the biggest things, at least for me, that I've seen is the concerns about ocean acidification and how that's affecting coral reefs. And so what essentially we're seeing is, you know, some people point to the fact that global warming seems to have stalled out. I mean, even if you look at the long-term trend, it's definitely still moving. But where has that heat been captured, and what's preventing it from being worse? And it's being essentially stored in the ocean. And so if we think about a tipping point, then certainly the ocean acidification and the dynamic changes that are happening there are leading us towards what some people call the sixth major extinction event in Earth history, right? So that's at least one of the things that I've seen relative to ocean specifically.
Yeah, well, and then literally there's the trash in the ocean, obviously the Pacific Garbage Patch and that whole thing that's going on. We spend a lot of time in Indonesia, and they have a big trash in the ocean problem because there isn't really sufficient trash services, you know, sent into the infrastructure. So you're seeing physical trash just going straight into the ocean. There was a recent photograph in the Huffington Post of a guy surfing a wave, and the wave is full of trash, and that's happening. So I mean that sort of like just on a very visceral level is also happening in terms of more the physical trash.
we laugh a little bit inappropriately, or at least I do. But if you're a fish and you live there, you know, if you get your oxygen through gills, and your gills are filling with plastics that are breaking down, that's a big problem,
Well, and we're
it's pretty
consuming
hard
those
to get away
fish
from.
a lot of times.
Yes,
so what are the fallouts of that down the line? We don't even really know yet.
Exactly. We are off the charts. We are past our known data.
And even closer to home, I mean, there's lots of seabirds, autopsies that have been done and shown like they've ingested all of these plastics. And so I think you really see, like Aubrey's saying, aside from the more hidden aspects, a real visceral representation. I mean, even Waimanalo, which I love to go.
Shores.
Exactly, yeah, you see it everywhere. And so I think that's one of the things, hopefully, that'll spur change is the ubiquity of these these things. I mean, plastic is throughout our lives. It's simply just part of everything now. So how do we deal with it consciously and responsibly, I think is a critical question.
All right. We also have a problem with pesticides getting into the ocean, getting into the food cycle, and being biologically magnified, so that we have a small amount of pesticide, as we saw with DDT and such, which is magnified through the system and intensified. It gets quite a bit worse.
Right. Yeah. I know that for me, like thinking about, and as an undergrad reading Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, and you think about it, we're talking about 50 years ago that we actually thought about DDT critically and opened up a systems perspective to think about the chain, right, the food chain. So I think that ultimately it's a lot of these ideas are still in just sort of their nascent stages, right? And it's surprising to think how far we've actually come with all these horrible things that have happened in a short period of time. And I think, if anything, what we should consider is the potentiality for radical changes to go in the other direction, right?
Yeah.
And oftentimes the discourse on sustainability and climate change can be really negative. People can feel very disempowered, like this is bigger than me. But I think smaller changes can accrue, and that we should look at taking risks, right? We should look at precisely the opportunity to do novel things in the face of this. So whether it's Farm Hack or other initiatives to sort of engage different parameters of it, I think, if anything, it's a great opportunity, right? I mean, what an amazing time to be alive, is the Chinese proverb, right? Better to live in interesting times, and this is certainly
Definitely interesting times.
Yeah.
What do you see as the risk here?
Well, that's the big question. I mean, part of my research relative and vis-a-vis of sustainability and climate change looks at, quote, radical solutions. So one of them is geoengineering. And geoengineering is the conscious manipulation of the environment precisely to limit the negative impacts of global warming. So for example, people think we should shoot all these, like particles to block the sun's radiation, or maybe we should then suck carbon out of the atmosphere. This is happening small scale already in Canada with things like what they're trying to do with the Alberta production. But ultimately, like, the science isn't there yet, right? So I think this question that's sort of lingering, precisely, at least for me, is how much time do we have, and what is the degree of change? And so your question about risk really is hedging a bet. And there's this really great video, I wish I could remember, it's on YouTube. It has to do with, like, it just makes 4 quadrants, and one of them basically says, right? Like, what if it's worst case scenario? In other words, like, the risks of not acting, right, far outweigh everything else. Like, so the changes that we should then try to do, and realizing that, again, lots of difficult questions need to be asked, right? Lots of really, potentially, answers that we don't, want to think about changing a lot of things relative to our lifestyle. And then that's the other thing too, is like, for whom are these changes going to be most impactful? And I think we see, well, who's really the cause of most of those changes? It's a certain lifestyle, right? It's a certain affluence that has really created these systems. And as other that lifestyle, right? Chinese middle class expanding, cars, right? How is it that you can work towards reorienting that perspective? Now, I mean, I was saying earlier, China is the world's largest polluter. They're also one of the top for renewable energy, right? So there's always literally a yin and a yang to that dynamic, and I think we're seeing that sort of work itself out now.
They realize the extent of their problems, because their problems have magnified so quickly in recent years that it's becoming very apparent.
Right.
And it's apparent to people when they come over. Just before the Olympics, they came along and outlawed several classes of vehicles, and very different than the United States. They didn't debate it. They just said they were legal. We're going to come around and pick it up if you don't turn it in.
Right.
So all the little yellow taxi cab buses disappeared all at once.
Right. I think that, for me, that when I read Tom Friedman's Hot, Flat, and Crowded, that was the most interesting chapter. He basically, the thought experiment, what if we could be China for a day? Which is to say, we can just do things across the board, right? And for here, we had a long discussion about plastic bags, right? And now we're working towards this ban. And so it's like, wait a second, what if we simply had the capacity overnight to say, that's it, this is going to happen? And if you look at what happened post-World War II with the advent of industrial agriculture, the reappropriation of nitrogen, right, from ammunition to use as, as a growth tool, right? That's precisely what happened. I mean, it almost became this sort of overnight change that allowed for new types of agriculture to emerge, right? So I think that, we often don't think in those terms, these sort of radical, critical tipping points. They happen all the time.
Yeah. Good point. And we should probably talk a little bit about the whole tipping point situation here, because we don't see when the tipping points are coming. And we see this in all kinds of systems. We saw it in the financial system when we hit the veritable financial collapse, which basically robbed trillions of dollars from investors worldwide. We see this in other systems, and in political systems we see a sort of a butterfly effect also. We saw the Arab Spring. I don't want to go too far off in the weeds from sustainability, but you see a very minor effect, such as a street vendor in, what was it, Tunisia, who had his scales taken by a corrupt government official who went out and set himself on fire in front of the government office, and that's where the uprising for the Arab Spring started, which then spread to several other countries. And so we see sometimes one seemingly minor event
Spark something much larger.
Exactly.
Right. And there was an interesting report that was released that looked at a major once-in-a-generation drought in Russia and China, and the export of wheat, and the Middle East as a large importer of wheat, and the additional civil stress that put, and how essentially it was government, bread, and sort of civil rights, the three of those together, that allowed for that sort of, I think the concern and all the fervor to really come to the fore. So I mean,
There actually are sustainability issues involved in some of these political
right, precisely.
issues.
Yes.
Everything,
It's all connected.
exactly.
They're all connected.
Yeah.
And we'll come back to that in just a moment after we take a short break here. So we'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Donna Blanchard of Kumukuhui Theater, and when I was young I used to love watching Charlie Chan movies on Family Classic TV on Sunday afternoons. Our show at Kumukuhui that runs from August 22nd through September 22nd is called Will the Real Charlie Chan Please Stand Up? It's written by Nancy P. Moss and takes place right here in Chinatown. I really hope you'll come in and watch it. You will love it. It's everything about the movies that you loved and more. Go to kumukuhua.org to get more information and your tickets.
Hi, thank you for tuning in. My name is Attila Saras, and I'm the host for ThinkTech Fridays. Join us online 24/7, 365 days a year at thinktechhawaii.com. We're talking about things that matter to Hawaii and around the world. My name again is Attila Saras, and I'm the host for ThinkTech Fridays. Mahalo.
I'm David Day, the host of Asian Review. This is a ThinkTech program in which we take the issues of the Asia-Pacific region, whether they be in business, in foreign policy, in national security, or geopolitics. And we take those issues and we try to probe down in some real depth. Maybe it's not always politically correct, but we get to the truth. We do things that the regular media can't do. And the reason that we can do those things is because we here at ThinkTech have the contacts, we have the network, and we can take the time and explore the issues in depth. Tune in every Thursday at 4 p.m. here at ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm David Day.
Hi, we're back. We're talking about creating a sustainable Hawaii. My guests are John Sweeny and Aubrey Yee from the Future Studies program at the University of Hawaii. And when we broke, where were we? We were
Politics and sustainability, how they intermesh.
we
Everything's
were
connected.
looking at the interaction
Yeah.
of politics, environmental systems, and you had brought up the wheat issue in
Right.
Russia.
Right.
Can we pick back up there?
Yeah, I think that that's one of the things that we're starting to see more people pay attention to are these critical tipping points and how really all of these systems are overlapping. And I think sustainability, like, as you've mentioned already, is not just about these sort of environmental, ecological things, but the social systems underlying them, right? The political systems, buttressing those, and how these all systems interconnect. And I think if you look at the sort of the critical vulnerabilities, oftentimes it's at the interstices, right? It's precisely at those points of intersection. So, and certainly in Hawaii, I think we're very much attuned and sensitive to that, as you mentioned earlier, with the food supply, without the big Matson container ship that comes here, right? Our dependency upon foreign oil, and yet sort of the fact that we live in a place with such a wide array of options for an alternative future, right? For a truly sustainable lifestyle, right? And then that even raises broader questions about, well, what would sustainable economic development mean relative to tourism, right? Relative to the impact of the military on the islands. And so how we can start to raise those questions, I think, is really key. I mean, a lot of our work focuses on the relational ecologies, right? How these points sort of come up.
Yeah.
And then specifically these actants, which can be events, they can be people, they can be things, they can be objects, and looking at those relationships and thinking critically about them. And I think that's what sustainability, if anything, really forces you and really demands that you do.
Yeah, I feel like the really innovative and successful businesses and organizations in this space are looking from that holistic perspective. So if they're developing a product or a business or some sort of organization, they're not just looking at like having a sustainability sector of what they do. It permeates the entire organization from start to finish in terms of who they deal with, how they deal with them, what they produce, what they consume, everything at all levels. So it really becomes more of an ethos, and it's very holistic in that way. And I think that's the movement that we're going towards.
Right, and I think a lot of local firms, like Aubrey said, are taking that on. So I blog for the Hui of KYA Studio, which is an affiliate of the KYA Design, which essentially is an architectural firm. But one of their principals had this vision to say, wait a second, it's not just enough that we offer design or we offer other sorts of means of helping people achieve their goals. How do we achieve a better future for the islands, right? And so they're looking at opening the conversation, bringing in different voices, and thinking about different sort of generational perspectives as well on what it means to have a sustainable society, and then really having a space for a conversation. And I think, if anything, that's what a lot of organizations really are keen to do and people want to participate in.
Great. Can we talk for just a moment about energy? As we mentioned earlier in the show, we have a state which runs primarily on fossil fuels. That we're trying to make a transition, and we've been integrating a little bit of solar and a little bit of wind into the system. Unfortunately, we can only take about 10%, before the system no longer functions properly.
Yeah.
The problem is we don't have good energy density either in wind or in solar. Cloud passes over your solar panels, you're not producing anymore. The wind dies, your wind turbines aren't producing anymore. Where do you see us going in the future? My own feeling is that we're looking at it from the wrong end. We need to be looking at deep efficiencies.
Yes, yeah, I'd agree with that for sure.
Right. Yeah, I think, if you think about what's our greatest strength and relevant to sustainable energy, we're surrounded by ocean, right? OTEC, whether it's, like temperature differential or wave energy, right? That's base load power, and that's really, I think, at the end of the day, what we need to talk about, right? And then, to speak to your point, well, part of the reason the renewables don't work is because the grid itself is antiquated, right? We keep trying to add and feed into this anachronistic system, and maybe we need to go back to the drawing board, distributed generation, right? And you've seen this work out in different places in different sorts of ways, but ultimately, radically rethinking our relationship to these energy systems and what we sort of can bring to that and how we can change that conversation.
And efficiency is huge. I'd agree with what you said. I think there's so many ways we can improve on efficiency that most people have no awareness of. So just raising the awareness of that on a personal level and on more organizational levels is critical.
Yeah, I agree very much. I think when it comes to Maui and the Big Island, you can also look at geothermal, another base load power source here. The problem being right now that as we integrate more and more of the low density power sources, such as wind, such as solar, you still have to have spinning reserves, meaning that you have generators online ready to pick up the slack if a cloud goes over, if the wind dies down or whatever. So you're limited to about 10% of your system until you go to a smart grid, which is going to cost a great deal of money. So,
right. I think that return on investment is always on everyone's mind, and I think what's very clear is that any money we spend now on these will pay dividends down the road. But that doesn't mean it's in any way easy to convince anyone that we need to tighten the belt and be able to focus on these. I think if you look at a lot of times, and this is happening in Spain right now, essentially killing the feed-in tariff, actually charging people for producing additional wattage, right? And I think that as you begin to see, and that's why it becomes a political issue, that's why it becomes a social issue, right? All these things, all these systems are deeply interconnected. So if Hawaii, and its isolation is a strength, obviously, and a weakness, right? If we can focus on what we can do here and focus on here, and I think bring that sense of resiliency to these systems, then that can be applicable to other places, right? We're in many ways the canary in the coal mine for these issues relative to sea level rise and climate change. We're waiting for, we've had these tsunami warnings, right? We keep waiting for one, right? A hurricane, we just had the incident. So I think precisely our sense of resiliency and our attentiveness to these future challenges, and like you said, hedging that risk is what's really critical, and having people attuned to it, and creating a safe space to talk about it. And I think that's what we try to do with Futures, is oftentimes you can get out of the present and get into a future space. It's easier to have a conversation, and sustainability is a great way to do that.
I agree very much. And when you start looking at the connection between the various elements, you do see that the sea level rise is going to impact Oceania much more severely than it is in the polar regions or the in-between regions. We're going to have a greater sea level rise here as we look at the oceans warming up even slightly. We get more and more water vapor that gets into the atmosphere. That's more energy storage, which is available for stronger storms. We have a feed-forward system that's much more dangerous than carbon dioxide in terms of creating a greenhouse effect. So as we move forward, we are In a situation where we're not feedback controlled, it kind of has a feed forward system, which ultimately puts us, and the systems we create in greater risk.
Right. The analogy I use for my students, like you're saying, is that we've put the car in drive and we've got our foot on the pedal and we've fallen asleep at the wheel. So we've, part of what I sort of come into my research repeatedly is people are, when they hear the term geoengineering, that we would consciously manipulate the environment. That's crazy, that's insane.
You tell them it's already happening.
Yeah, we've already done it, right? So we've already added so much carbon that we've reached a 450 parts per million that hasn't happened in millennia, right? There weren't humans around the last time atmospheric carbon was that high.
Yeah.
And so really this question of scale, I think, is critical because native Hawaiians geoengineered. If you're building fish ponds and doing irrigation, that's a form of geoengineering, right? What we've done with carbon is geoengineering. So can we in fact geoengineer, and it's not just about sort of like continuing this lifestyle, but finding sustainable ways to manage these changes, right? To surf these tsunamis of change, and then to mitigate the potential sort of future outliers, right? To have an ethic that allows us to respond, I think, in ways that are positive, and to really sort of hopefully delimit the catastrophes that very well could lie ahead.
I agree very much. When we talk about the mix of the various influences coming together here, we tend to sometimes get unpredictable results. Going back to what you mentioned in Limits to Growth, they did a series of these about every 10 years. And one of the prior ones was called Beyond the Limits. And the reason it was called Beyond the Limits is we had exceeded the limits that had been established before. So we're past the carrying capacity of the planet in general here. If we roll back on the advanced technology, we're kind of in a difficult situation where we have 7 billion people and growing, and we are at our limits in our ability to feed them. You introduce certain crop things, and I don't remember if it was you that brought to my attention the UG99 virus that affects wheat. Little things like this, all of a sudden something happens and we can get a major collapse of a crop, which threatens an awful lot of people.
Right.
Further, we end up with genetic strains of crops such as BT corn, which is prevalent right now. The BT is a toxin that was genetically engineered in there to kill off the corn borer. And this is also present in some of the GMO soy. GMO is a genetically modified organism, just so sorry for dropping the acronyms here for people at home. But this introduces other dangers because we don't know exactly what this does in the long term.
Right, and that's the concern, right? That the cure will be worse than the disease, and I think that oftentimes we've seen that historically. The trick is now is how do we do the necessary research, right? How do we take the right steps and try to find solutions that again, hopefully delimit disease catastrophe, but also then open up new possibilities. Because oftentimes we think about sustainability and future resiliency, we don't think about technological development, right? So maybe we will develop the capacity to remove carbon from the atmosphere in a way.
But we can't count on it.
Right, but we can't, or maybe there will be a breakthrough in battery storage technology that allows different renewables on the grid, right? But Aubrey's point is exactly the the elephant in the room. Like, we can't count on those things, right? If we deal with what we have going on now, we take the appropriate steps, then the time has certainly come to invest in a truly sustainable infrastructure.
Yeah, and I think that really takes questioning what are the paradigms that brought us to this point, and do we want to continue with those going forward, or is there a way that we can rethink our value systems and the way that we view our lives that would create a healthier system overall? So really asking those deep questions, I think, is a really important part of the conversation.
So you're basically suggesting that we need a values education component here.
Yeah, I know, like a lot of the work we do at Kanu Hawaii is talking about island-based values. So looking at like how do we in Hawaii, what are our value systems that are a little bit different? How do we value community? How do we value aina, space, place? Those sorts of things that could potentially inform the way that we look at sustainability going forward. And I think there's a lot there that shows us that there's a lot in life that can be valued and make life joyful and beautiful without having to consume as much as we are today. That in fact we may actually have richer, more valuable lives that are feel more fulfilled if we do consume less and live in different ways.
If people want more information on Kanu Hawaii,
kanuhawaii.org And
Okay.
it's a member-based organization, grassroots social change, so anyone can become involved.
Okay, so KANU.
Yes, KANU
Hawaii.org. Okay, great for people who want to
Yeah.
look that up in the future. Values education has been occurring more and more in the school system here, but still we are kind of locked into a consumer mindset, and the consumer mindset says, yeah, this is great. I'll try to recycle my paper, but when I flip the switch, the power better be on.
Yeah.
You know.
So we've become really accustomed to those luxuries.
And the situation when we look at the energy density involved is that we don't really have the energy density in solar power, say, to be running clothes dryers. You know, we could be looking at small scale solutions and putting our clothes in a clothesline the way a lot of people did for
And a lot of people do in lots of parts of
Millennia.
the world. You go to other places and a clothes dryer is not a common thing to have in a house. So
Right, right.
we've become accustomed to these certain lifestyle options, but they are options. So.
Now the problem becomes when you start looking at mega developments, and a lot of times we're looking right now at very large scale developments.
Yeah.
Last week's show we talked about the Mauka area plan development, and what happens when you take an area and you add about 400% to the population, you put people in high rises, and you end up in a situation where sustainability kind of goes out the window. Now you don't have clotheslines, everybody has to use clothes dryers, okay? Now you can't have solar water heating, which again uses a low energy density solar source.
Are you talking about high rises or?
Yeah, when you're in a high rise, you've got certain difficulties you don't have. Now the other alternative though is kind of more of an urban sprawl.
I feel like there's a lot of work going on in some of the high rises being done here in Hawaii, actually trying to incorporate more like energy efficiency systems and things like that from the ground up. So, I mean, I do actually see in urban development that there's an opportunity to create more efficient buildings, and I see that happening with certain developers. But I would think that's a much better way to go than urban sprawl. Personally.
Okay, we can talk about that in just a moment. We're going to take a break right here, and we'll be right back.
Aloha, I'm Jay Fidel. This is ThinkTech Hawaii, broadcasting live from the Pioneer Plaza in downtown Honolulu. We raise public awareness about tech, energy, and globalism in Hawaii. Technology is critical to our state. A vibrant tech sector will give us new prospects in the global marketplace and will offer great careers and make our economy more resilient. Streaming live on Ustream and Spreaker, ThinkTech allows its hosts and guests invaluable opportunities to report important events and discuss important questions, and to be heard here in Hawaii and around the world. You can find links to our live streams on thinktechhawaii.com or on our mobile website, m.thinktechhawaii.com. And you can see our archive on YouTube. It's all just a click away. We want to do whatever we can to keep Hawaii relevant, connected, and thriving in the complexity of the 21st century. We hope you will help us in those efforts. Tune in today. This is ThinkTech. I'm Jay Fidel. Mahalo.
Back again. I'm Charlie Willson. We're talking about creating a sustainable Hawaii. My guests are John Sweeny, Aubrey Yee, both from the political science program at UH Manoa, and both teaching political science and future studies. So we've been talking about various sustainability issues and how they connect together both environment, political issues, and resource use, resource depletion, and such. In the long term, humanity has gone through lots of changes here. You know, the lifestyle that we have right now is very different than the lifestyle people had 100 or 150 years ago.
Right.
If you go back maybe 150 years,
generations, yeah.
right, your light was whale oil, you know, and if you went back 100 years before that, it was all the solar receipts, you know, directly from the sun.
Yeah.
And we were able to maintain, as we mentioned earlier, a population, with the exception of Oahu, comparable to the type of population we have in the islands right now. And in the long term, we've got to look back, we've got to look again at either living within the solar receipts or having different technologies than we're using right now. So we have challenges ahead of us.
Yeah.
Now you had just mentioned things like green building standards and the difference between having a lot of people in the urban core versus, you know, distributed development.
Yeah.
Personally, I'm a little bit antsy because I live in the urban core about
Yeah.
putting too many people here, just because I see what happens.
Sure.
And also, if you look at sea level rise figures, you're seeing within 100 years, some of these areas are going to have massive flooding problems because the sea level rise is going to make these developments unsustainable. Now, you had mentioned building standards. I know the GBC, Green Building Council, has their own set of standards, the LEED standards, and these have been promoted as a path to sustainability, and they do a good thing, but on the other hand, when you start proposing that we're going to add, as in Kaka'ako, an additional 20,000 plus people to the area, it's pretty hard for me to say, okay, that's going to be sustainable just because you develop these standards of window shades and things to keep the heat out, so on and so forth. Do you have an opinion on that?
Well, I think the LEED standards are a good start. I think they're sort of shallow in certain respects, and that people need to go deeper. I do see some developers trying to go deeper, and I think there's a lot out there that is much more kind of forward-thinking technology. I guess in terms of like urban sprawl versus urban core, we are dealing with people, population is growing. It's happening. It's probably not going to shift unless there's some major catastrophe that happens. But we have to, think of ways to create housing for people. So I'd rather look at more creative options in the urban core than seeing our open spaces taken up by sprawl. So, I mean, if we're going to look at development, to me, that's the better course of action in terms of thinking for the future.
Yeah, and I think along with that, there's often, we go to the adage, right? The devil you know is better than the devil you don't. And, we can't deny the overarching power of a certain trajectory that we seem to be on, right? So, do we look at endogenous models of change or exogenous? Do we look at inside versus outside? This Slovenian philosopher, Slavoj Žižek, has this adage that we live at an interesting moment where it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism.
Yeah.
And so I think that what we're starting to see is
kind of true.
Yeah, right? I mean, it's all these zombie apocalypse, dystopia films. I mean, we're more welcoming that than sort of a change in this sort of lifestyle, right, that we've gone over the last few generations. So, but I think that to speak to Aubrey's point, like, people are taking risks, they're taking chances precisely because it's an investment not just in a sort of future way of thinking about, profit, but in a broader, right? And so this sustainable model sort of, tripartite, people, profits, planet. And I think that is beginning to work itself out in different sort of ways. I think, again, the question is, what kind of time do we have, right?
Sure.
We could obviously do more, we could obviously do better, but things are in fact happening that are hopefully moving us in the right direction. There's a new charter school, the SEEKS school. It's about sustainable questioning, just started this year. So I think that people are really taking it and rethinking sort of long-held beliefs, like, well, how can we reorient questions about education, like values, really try to engender the types of students, the types of citizens that we want to have in this sustainable society, because I think that's part of it, not
the
just
longer-term social change.
Exactly, like building people to live in this future, not just a future that we'll hope that people will like, right? Actually creating the change through embodiment in people's lives.
Which kind of brings up a couple of questions. One, well, we're going to have you both back as guests to talk more about the deep future than the shallow future. Right now we're talking more about the standards here. But if you start looking at the deep future, I think you're right. We have to start changing people's perspectives in a fundamental way. However, to a certain extent, what you see in the popular consciousness is a reflection of well, let's just say it's an indicator of things that may happen and people are worried about. What happens when you turn on the educational channels now, like the Discovery and History and channels like that. What you see is prepper shows, People are talking about what happens when everything goes to hell in a handbasket.
That's why I stopped watching cable TV.
Right. You turn to a different channel and you see zombie shows.
Sure.
It's like the number of zombie films and zombie shows now is going off the charts.
Well, yeah, and I think that's just all meant to really like disempower, because then people feel like they have no options and no choices, and that we might as well just prepare for the worst. Whereas I feel like the things we've been talking about, these small changes that are happening in the communities around us, are really empowering.
Right.
So focusing on that kind of movement, I think, is really critical.
Right. The problem is that we all know what we have to do. I mean, we have a pretty good sense of the changes that have to be accomplished.
Sure.
Okay. However, in the back of everybody's mind now is we're thinking collapse. And we saw a pretty near meltdown of the financial system. We've seen large pretty near meltdowns in multiple systems along the way related to natural disasters. And we keep focusing on brittle systems where you put a lot of population in a really tiny area and you have a system that is more failure prone. Do you see that we have a way out of this dilemma?
Wow, I wish I had that answer.
It's a big question, yeah. I mean, I think if anything, what we try to do with futures, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more next time, is imagine the possibilities, however improbable. And so whether it's a radical tipping point leading to collapse, whether it's we pull back the reins and we're able to get our act together, or whether it's some transformational breakthrough that leads us into new directions we haven't even seen, if anything, it's important to explore all the possibilities. I mean, I definitely think what seems to be the most likely future is probably the one that none of us want. But again, there's nothing to say that we might not get our act together or something could happen. So I think at least from a sustainability perspective and why resiliency ties into that in the future so naturally, about exploring those possibilities, right? About taking those big sort of leaps, asking big questions and seeing what comes back.
Yeah, and I think the question too about collapse that I've been thinking about a lot lately is, is it going to be collapse in terms of what we think of as this big grand collapse, or more of a decay? And I think
Yes.
more likely we're going to, and we are seeing decays of certain things and certain systems kind of crumbling versus just falling apart overnight. So how do we manage that? And I feel like humans are very resilient creatures, so we'll find ways within that. So really just getting back to those deep values and underscoring like how can we think about the world in different ways and our relationships in different ways to ourselves, to nature, to everything, so that when these changes start to happen, we have the capacity to see them as opportunities rather than challenges.
I like that perspective a lot, and
Helps me sleep at night at least.
Absolutely.
and we can probably bring this in when we do the next show and we talk about the longer term future concepts, because there is opportunity here as systems break down. There's a catabolic process where what breaks down is then picked up and reused, and sometimes that creates opportunities in other directions here. We're about to wrap our show here. We've been talking about creating a sustainable Hawaii. Our guests have been John Sweeny and Aubrey Yee, both from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, both affiliated and both about to receive their PhDs. Congratulations, in order very soon here
When we're done.
in the Future Studies program. Next time we'll be looking at some deep future concepts, and we hope you'll come back and join us. Our tapes can be found, our YouTube versions of the show can be found at www.thinktechhawaii.com. So go to www.thinktechhawaii.com and you'll be able to find this and our past shows. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.